Welcome to The 5 Books, where each week we talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen, and today I'll be talking with Fran Fabriczki about her new novel, Porcupines, about a young immigrant mother and her increasingly inquisitive daughter who wakes up one day and decides to find out who her father is.
She looks for her father, and I think what she's really looking for is community, family, something that she's missing. It's just kind of been identified as this figure. I've always thought of it as a bit of a red herring because I don't think her finding her father is that important. I think it's important as an engine for that stasis to be appended.
Fran Fabriczki was born in Budapest. She has lived in Los Angeles and currently lives in London. She studied English at the University of Cambridge and worked in publishing for several years before going freelance to focus on her own writing. She graduated from the University of East Anglia's Creative Writing MA in 2022. Porcupines is her debut novel. In this episode, we'll talk with Fran about James Wood's The Nearest Thing to Life and building a life around art.
It kind of validated and fostered this idea in me that that literature could be kind of a life organizing principle. And then becoming a writer as well, it added a different layer to that experience. I think as a writer now, I feel more present in the world because I'm noticing things that I want to use in my writing. And that sounds a bit calculating, but it actually has made me, I think, a better person because I'm more present, I'm more aware of my surroundings.
And we'll discuss the short story Down at the Dinghy from 9 Stories by J.D. Salinger.
To be able to hold 2 ideas at the same time or 2 feelings at the same time that are conflicting. I mean, it's always important, but he's making you do it in real time through the story, seeing the humanity in all people. And he's just doing it in a technical way, which is kind of brilliant.
All that and more coming up next. Welcome to The 5 Books, Fran. I'm so happy to have you here. Your book, Porcupines, is the New Reads pick for April. So hopefully many of our listeners who are also New Read subscribers have at least started to delve into the book. Porcupines is a book about mothers and daughters. It's also about the strange distances that can exist between people who love each other. And I just adored your writing. I found myself smiling over and over again at all of these incredibly funny and astute observations about life, about childhood, about immigration, about America. So for listeners who haven't encountered the book yet, can you start by telling us a little bit about Porcupines and what sparked the idea for the novel?
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you for having me, first of all. And Porcupines is essentially a story about a single mother, Sonia, whose daughter, Mila, drags her on this very chaotic trip from LA to San Francisco. And during the course of this trip, some elements of Sonia's past are revealed that she's been trying to hide from her daughter. And it goes kind of back and forth from 2 timelines, so her past in 1989 and present day, which in this case is 2001. The focus is on this mother and daughter, but it's also about Sonia's wider family and where she comes from and her sister, Rena. And yeah, the inspiration for the novel it's always so hard to pinpoint like the one specific inspiration because it all kind of comes together from different things swirling around in your mind. But one thing was, it was kind of meant as a love letter to LA where I lived as a child. And I really wanted to capture that time in the early 2000s in LA and that kind of the contrast between that kind of suburban boredom of LA, but also the glamour of the idea of LA. And then this coupled with this character who's very loosely based on my own mom that I wanted to try and work into this novel. And that was the spark for it all.
Book 1, A Jewish Book from Childhood, The Devil's Arithmetic by Jane Yolen.
So I was born in Hungary and I moved to LA as a child. I lived there for quite a few years and then moved back to Hungary again for high school. And then for college, I went to the UK, and this is where I live now. So that's sort of mapping the geography of my life. I've been thinking about this in relation to the books that we're picking, how Jewishness was relevant in my life as a child. Just thinking about it, when I was in Hungary, I don't think I was aware that I was Jewish, which is not because it was kind of a secret, but it just wasn't an aspect of life that was kind of prominent. And then I moved to America, where I already had family, where my aunt and her family lived, my 3 cousins, and they had a Jewish household that was fairly observant. And so that was my first experience of Judaism, essentially. And because I was kind of obsessed with my cousins, I think there's something wonderful about cousin relationships, because there isn't that barrier to the relationship that there is with other school children when you don't know them, but they're not as close as siblings. So there's a novelty to them. So I think, cousins can be like a wonderful relationship. And I was kind of really in awe of them. And they, went to synagogue every week, and they went to Jewish school. And so I became kind of obsessed with it while I was there.
And what brought you back to Hungary?
Essentially, it was never meant to be a very long time in the US. It was never a permanent move. So that's where more of my family is, and that's where my mom was working. So we moved back, and it was kind of a jarring cultural shift again.
Yeah, going back for high school, I imagine, would be difficult. Okay, so the book that you wanted to talk about was The Devil's Arithmetic. So if you could first give us like a short description of the book, and then tell us why you chose it.
Yeah, so The Devil's Arithmetic is essentially a time slip novel where the main character, Hannah, is at a Passover Seder, and she's kind of bored with the whole thing, and she's not interested in her family's stories of the past. And then she is kind of thrust back into the past, and not to the biblical era that you would expect, but to 1941 in a Polish village. So you can kind of imagine what's happening there. And what's interesting about this book, though, is that it then follows her through the experience of going to a concentration camp. And this is a book for children, so it's quite intense. I read it in the 5th grade, so I was like 10, 11, I guess.
It's a terrifying book.
It is. It is. It's strange. I don't know if it would kind of fly today, but I think it's very interesting that it was presented to us as something appropriate to read.
This was in school, you said you read it, right?
Yeah, it was assigned in school. We were split into these groups to have a discussion about a book, and I signed up to this one. As I said, I was kind of obsessed at this point, with Jewishness, and I wanted to learn more, and we were assigned to these groups to discuss it. And I remember that the discussion was led by a parent, and this parent was a psychologist. And in the context of this discussion, she explained to us what empathy is. And I remember this being the first time I'd ever heard of the concept of empathy, which is interesting. So it was kind of forever in my mind tied to this book and reading in general, and remembering our history.
That's so interesting. What was the lesson about empathy as it related to the book?
I think I'm fuzzy on the details of this. It's just such a strong memory that she explained to us what empathy is. I think because the character Hannah is essentially in a very intense way forced to empathize with her relatives and ancestors, because, literally walking a mile in their shoes.
In the novel, we learn about Sonia's father towards the very end of the book and his Holocaust stories. I'm wondering what kind of stories you heard growing up about your own family.
Well, I think it's kind of a typical story of like the grandparents not really wanting to discuss what happened. All of my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. They passed away now. But so it's kind of had to be teased out over the years. And actually, I learned a lot about my grandfather's experience from an interview he did for a stranger. There's like hours of videos of him talking about his experience in a concentration camp, but he would never actually tell us that. But I think this is a kind of a typical experience.
Yeah, I wonder if it's a more typical experience among survivors who stayed in the Eastern Europe as opposed to survivors who came to the West. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, I think so. I think, and my grandfather, whom I spoke of just now, he was kind of a staunch communist. And I think part of his ethos was also that this kind of uncomplaining, I guess, focusing on work and focusing on what you have. And of course, because of his experiences and also because of the communist ethos around religion, he was not very religious himself. So this kind of got excised from the narrative of his life in a way.
Book 2, A Jewish Book from Adulthood. The short story Down at the Dinghy from 9 Stories by J.D. Salinger.
This is a story in the collection 9 Stories from Salinger. These are all stories from sort of post-war America. And this particular story, Down at the Dinghy, it's a very brief story. It's something like 10 pages. And it's about a family. I think the father is Jewish, the mother is not, and their 4-year-old son who's dealing with some sort of emotional difficulty. And we see the mother try to coax it out of him. And we find out that one of the maids in their household has called his father a racial slur, and he's upset about that. I think what he does brilliantly is he starts the story from the perspective of the maids, and we'll eventually find out that the maids were the ones who caused the pain in the little boy by calling his father a racial slur. But we don't know that at the beginning, and because as a reader, immediately you want to identify with whoever you're presented with right away. You start the story with these maids and you start to sympathize with them because, they've been working hard. This family is probably wealthy and they're sort of subject to them. And, it's the end of the workday. And then he sort of moves you out of their perspective and follows the mom down to the dinghy, to the son. And then you realize what's happened. And you're kind of forced to reconcile the fact that you've sympathized with the people who've caused this boy pain. And I think that's such a brilliant thing to do. It's a technical thing, but also he's testing whether you can square away those feelings. I think that's just so important right now as well,
What's so important?
To be able to hold 2 ideas at the same time or 2 feelings at the same time that are conflicting. I mean, it's always important, but he's making you do it in real time through this story. And I'm not saying that, it's not a case of let's give the anti-Semite the benefit of the doubt. It's not that at all. And it's that, seeing the humanity in all people. And he's just doing it in a technical way, which is kind of brilliant.
Mm-hmm. And then there's something also, I think, about how the mother responds to the boy when the son shares what he's overheard.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a very typical parental instinct to try to minimize the pain immediately. I mean, she just, comes straight out with this kind of lie to make him feel better. I can so understand that. And I think, there's something really poignant about it. I think it also might be saying something about the fact that, the boy is angry. He's angry at his father, I think, because he's Jewish in essence, and I think it teases out those complicated feelings we have. And as a parent, you think this is a complicated legacy I'm passing on to my child. And you just kind of hope that they feel the joy of it rather than the pain. And I think that last moment is really, that's what it captures.
Yeah. And she doesn't malign the people who said it either.
Exactly. And then you realize that at the beginning, the maids were kind of nervous about something and you didn't know what it was, but you realize they're nervous about whether the boy is going to tell the mother. And there's even a sentence where I think it's implied that one of the maids is suggesting the other should get a new job, maybe, or look for a new job because she might be fired and she's not, It's just, yeah.
Yeah, he does a great job.
You can tell I love this story.
Yeah, I love it too. I was vaguely aware that Salinger had a Jewish father, but I didn't really know much more about that.
Me neither. This surprised me when I read this.
So I was reading via Jerome Charon, who wrote a book called Sergeant Salinger, that Salinger's grandfather had his eye torn out of his socket in a pogrom around 1880 and was much more observant or religious than Salinger, and that Salinger, who went by Sonny, and his family, his parents made him a bar mitzvah with like a for hire rabbi, and his grandparents were very angry. And then the grandfather threw the father out of the house, and then shortly after that, the father announced that they were no longer Jewish, and that Salinger's mother, who he knew as Miriam, was not Jewish. Salinger didn't know that until then. She had converted.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. I think with a lot of these stories in this collection, you can't help but kind of think of him a little bit in them as a character, but I don't have as much of a context about Salinger as I think you probably do as an American. I think, the mythology that comes with it, that he was a recluse, I only vaguely know that. So I experienced this purely as the text, basically.
When did you read it?
I read this as an adult. It was definitely after I had moved back to Hungary. In America, I had essentially never experienced antisemitism, which I know must sound strange, but I had a kind of joyful, uncomplicated relationship with Jewishness. And then I moved back to Hungary, and that was quite different. In Hungary, I think antisemitism was more pervasive, if not as potent, if that makes sense. It's just a part of kind of everyday life. It's just kind of assumed that if you're saying someone is a Jew, that's not meant in a positive way. I moved there as a teenager, for example, and a boy I liked said he didn't like Jews. It wasn't that I wanted to get angry and get on a soapbox about anti-Semitism. I just didn't want to be Jewish anymore. And I think that's a very natural reaction to, as an adolescent, you just want to be liked. And then I read this story and I could really relate to that feeling of ambivalence towards your own Jewishness that's in this story. And I think that's why it resonated with me so much.
There's a similar moment toward the end of Porcupines when Sonia is the protagonist and her sister, they're at the market when they're in Budapest and a group of boys walks by and one says, "Such a pretty little Jew." And you, the narrator, says, "No one had bothered to tell them they were Jewish, and who would think to ask?" This revelation lingered in the girls' minds quietly, in the place where ideas without context go, either to wither and die or to gather the courage to demand for themselves a frame of reference. For Sonia, it did the former, for Rina, the latter. And so you kind of identify this moment as being the impetus for each of them in their different religious experiences. It felt so similar to this Salinger story. I wonder if that was connected for you at all or just a coincidence.
I mean, I love that you drew that connection. I think it was a coincidence or maybe just something that lingered at the back of my mind, maybe. But it's definitely true. There's that moment when you experience something like that, when it can lead to either a push away or a pulling closer, depending on your personality and the context you're in. I think that's, what's being begun here in this story for this character's early life.
I was also curious because your book, Porcupines, also centers a child, and Salinger is famous for his portrayal of children. And there was something about the way that Mila was portrayed in she's precocious, not in the same kind of obvious, overt ways, but just in how she relates to her mother. I wonder what it was like for you writing from the perspective of a child.
Yeah, it's such a tricky one to get right because, this word precocious is kind of loaded as well. I think there are a lot of characters in literature, children who are described as precocious, so you don't want to fall into being sort of a stereotype. And I think what I try to shade her character in a nuanced way to say that she wasn't some sort of child genius. She was kind of average at school. She was average at the violin. I think these things make her more relatable. And actually, initially, I had drawn the character as much more distant towards her classmates. And then I realized that what would be more realistic is if she cared about the social dynamics of her school. She just didn't know how to affect them, if that makes sense. And I think that's also more poignant. And then there's also the wider context of why she's not integrating, which is kind of explored in the novel.
I very much appreciated that she wasn't the child genius, that you took pains, they're on this trip with her orchestra, and yet, you take pains to say she was not that great.
Exactly. I think it's, for one, it's more relatable, but there's also more to explore and disappointment as a character than achievement. It's more fertile ground for literature.
Book 3, a book that changed your worldview. The Nearest Thing to Life by James Wood.
The Nearest Thing to Life is an essay collection by the literary critic James Wood. And it's really hard to describe what this is actually about because every page and every sentence is kind of dense with ideas. So it's really hard to distill. I won't do it justice, but essentially it's an essay collection. It's about art. And the reason I chose this is because this was a gift given to be my professor at university. It was a graduation present. It was this beloved professor. I think, everyone has this kind of once in a lifetime educator that kind of makes a real difference in their lives. And she gave me this book, and it was after final exam. So I didn't want to look at another book for never again, basically. But then I came back to it a couple months after when I'd started working, and it became this kind of lifeline back to art. I think she knew it would be, and the book, I think, the title refers to this George Eliot quote. It's, "Art is the nearest thing to life. It is a mode of amplifying experience and extending our contact with our fellow men beyond the bounds of our personal lot." And I think this is what resonated with me the most. It kind of validated and fostered this idea in me that that literature could be kind of a life organizing principle. Yeah, and then becoming a writer as well, it added a different layer to that experience. I think as a writer now, I feel, this sounds a bit woo-woo, but I feel more present in the world because I'm noticing things that I want to use in my writing. And that sounds a bit calculating, but it actually has made me, I think, a better person because I'm more present. I'm more aware of my surroundings. And he calls this, or something like this, serious noticing, which is what artists do. They kind of take the details of life and distill them, and then someone looks at those details and has a new version of reality before them. Yeah, it's just a brilliant book.
That's beautiful. You talked about noticing and serious noticing. We just had another conversation with Mati Friedman, and he was talking about that maybe that's what it means to be a prophet, is this act of noticing, and that can be like the power of art.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such an interesting thought. And actually in this book, I think Wood draws parallels from art to religion as well. He had an evangelical upbringing, and he writes beautifully about that. I think there are definitely parallels.
He also talks about, exile, and he calls it homelooseness. And I wonder how you relate to that, given your own personal story.
Yeah, I think he writes brilliantly about emigration. And, of course, he emigrated from the UK to America, which I think is possibly the most benign form of uprooting yourself. But I think he takes it back to that baseline of what it feels like to be outside of your home context, and in a really relatable way. Yeah, I found that essay fascinating.
Book 4, the book you're reading now, Going Home by Tom Lamont.
Okay, so I'm reading Going Home by Tom Lamont, which is a book about a man who's kind of made it out of his suburban community, but comes back to visit. And then for various plot reasons I won't spoil, he ends up taking care of his best friend's 2-year-old son, Joel. It's a really affecting book, and I actually started reading it a while ago and had to stop, and not because it's boring, but because I just couldn't emotionally handle where I suspected the author was taking me, and I think that's a sign of a really good book. It's also set in this North London Jewish community that's really interesting.
Book 5, the author's latest book, Porcupines by Fran Fabriczki. I wanted to talk to you about the title of the book, which comes from the rabbi in the story telling Sonia the story of Schopenhauer's Porcupines. This is what the rabbi says to her. They felt the cold, so they all huddled together for warmth. Then they felt the prickle of one another's needles and sprang apart, together, apart, and so on into infinity. This was mankind's lot, he said. So how did porcupines become the central metaphor for the story?
I didn't write it thinking of a theme, but if there was a theme in my mind, in the back of my mind while writing it, it would have been something along the lines of community and the various ways we try to find community and what stops us from integrating into a community. And I think it just really clicked into place when, I knew about Schopenhauer's Parable of the Porcupines, and I think it just came up somewhere in my reading again. And I just thought that's kind of perfectly describes the way that Sonia is with her family and with the community she's trying, but also not really trying hard enough to integrate into in LA. It just kind of perfectly encapsulated something about the way her and her family were acting.
The other part that I wanted to ask you about is Mila, the daughter's determination to find out who her father is. And that's kind of the engine of the story. What was it about that question that drew you to telling the story through that device?
It's interesting. I think that was more of like a plot device, to get things going. I've always thought of it as a bit of a red herring because I don't think her finding her father is that important. I think it's important as an engine for that stasis to be appended. So she looks for her father. And I think what she's really looking for is community, family, something that she's missing. It's just kind of been identified as this figure. I like the idea that she would take these movies that, might have been swirling around in her head. And it's kind of almost a generic plot line, the search for the unknown father. And so I was kind of playing around with the idea that she might have taken this from the movies and TV shows she was watching, trying to use it for her own life in kind of a clumsy way.
That makes sense. It's also, it is the more overt engine to the story, as you put it. One of the things that I so admired was the way that the political realities completely shape the characters' lives, all of their choices, and yet the way they're presented is very much in the background. Like you almost have to be like, oh, wait, but this is why these things are happening. So when Rina, Sonia's sister, is a teenager, their father is serving as a diplomat in Washington, D.C., and Rina chooses to stay in the U.S., and that has huge implications for the rest of the family returning to communist Hungary at the time. And then later, Sonia overstays her visa and stays in the U.S. and enters into a marriage in order to remain in the U.S. legally. Tell me about that decision for those moments to unfold so subtly.
Right. Yeah. I think I was really interested in how superpowers like Russia and America kind of their, politics affect a small country like Hungary. I wanted to access it through real human lives, obviously, because that's the stuff of novels and, literature. So it's really difficult, but interesting, I think, to distill those big forces and see how they affect real lives. So I wanted the shifts in the novel to be partly caused by these outside forces that maybe they're not even aware of. So in a sense, you see them making these decisions and you think, well, that's a bad decision, or that's obviously you shouldn't do that, or that's, but there are other forces at play. There always are.
I guess I'm wondering, those big moments that impact their lives, do you see your own life as having been shaped by some of those bigger stories as well?
That's so interesting. I've never thought of it in relation to my own life, but obviously it must have. I grew up post-communist era in Hungary, and obviously I'm affected by my parents and their beliefs and my grandparents. So I think we all are.
I wanted to delve a little more into the religious lives of the two sisters, Sonia and Rina, which we touched on a little bit earlier. And the father says, everyone in America is part of some cult, including your sister, even if she calls it religion. And, there is this tension between the two sisters. Rina has chosen an Orthodox, observant Jewish lifestyle, and Sonia sees it as rigid and boring and cold. And Rina feels so disappointed that her sister kind of can't recognize the beauty in her life or just can't appreciate the life that she's chosen. What interested you about putting those sisters on those two different trajectories?
Well, this is something that I've seen play out in my own family. Various members of the family are either more religious or more secular. I thought it was interesting that there's often more derision towards the members of the family who are more religious. I think this is partly to do with coming from a communist country. There's a sort of a hesitancy and towards religious practice. I think it comes back to that moment when they experienced that moment of antisemitism and the fact that just different people react to these things differently, and it leads them down a completely different path. And even though they've come from the exact same family, the exact same historical moment and political context, their personalities are going to mean that they take completely wildly different paths. And I just thought that was interesting. And then there's the push and pull of, sibling relationships. You want that closeness, but then you have a different lifestyle. Is it really the lifestyle that's pulling them apart, or is it something else? Is it like a natural, breaking up of a family that happens over adulthood? I think for the character Sonia, it's a little bit painful to lose her sister, and she identifies losing her as losing her to religion because these things happen concurrently. So I think that sticks with her and makes her a little biased against the whole thing.
Yeah, and I think as a reader, you're not sure how much you buy into Sonia's take on Rina and whether or not her life is just as rigid and boring and dull
Definitely.
as Sonia is portraying it to be.
I really hope that people read it as that, because I wanted to, Sonia is fallible. She's not perfect. And I think, her view of Rina's life is very much colored by her own experience and her own age and her own interests. And she wants to party. And, it's the natural difference of 6 years of one sister having children, of having a life. And that's a different lifestyle in itself. I tried to show that Rina does find joy in it, and she needed that community that she didn't have growing up for various reasons. And that was how her life became fulfilled.
Yeah, I think that becomes especially clear. There's a flashback scene where you see the beginning of her interest in Judaism and this friendship that she makes with this other woman who introduces her to, who becomes her husband. It's interesting to talk about seeing things just through Sonia's perspective, because so much of the book that I appreciated were these outside takes on things that were going on that just portrayed things in such a totally new lens. Everything from Las Vegas to, American childhood, the PTA, all of it. And in general, what did writing an immigrant narrator, what do you think that allowed you to capture about cultural misunderstanding?
I think, outsider perspective, fish out of water perspective is always interesting. For a long time, I didn't know what to write about because I feel like I am an outsider in almost every country I live in. I wouldn't call any place home at this point. I remember telling my dad, I don't know what to write about. And he said, well, write about America. You have maybe something to say from your perspective. And I think everyone does who can see it from the outside will have a little bit of a unique perspective.
Again, I just want to say that there were so many moments where that outsider perspective just, shifts how you view something. In the scenes that take place in Budapest, I think you also give the reader a really deep perspective on the immigrant experience in the U.S. and just the gap and the chasm between, her experience there and her experience here.
Yeah, I think that was important to show because otherwise you don't understand what the appeal is. And I think at once I'm trying to present the American lifestyle as something kind of funny and outrageous and kind of kitsch even, but also very endearing and appealing to someone like Sonia. So you had to have that context of where she's coming from in order to understand why that is appealing.
Yeah, and you see that when she's in Las Vegas and they're in this themed hotel, and she takes so much delight in all of these things that maybe someone else would roll their eyes out. I think you really fully appreciate how much she appreciates all of that full-on Americanness.
Yeah, I think also, and it's important to focus on what's joyful in a place rather than just what's difficult, because I think, it's easy to slip into, if you're talking about, an outsider moving to a new place, it can be easy to focus on the difficulties that they face. But what about the joy of that place, or how suddenly a place that you don't necessarily belong to can feel more like home than your own home?
So where do you feel most at home now?
Oh gosh, that's a difficult question. Nowhere really. I feel like, but it's kind of an interesting state to be in. This, like, I think I've spent too much time away from Hungary to really feel at home there. And, America briefly was home, and I thought I was American, because I said the Pledge of Allegiance every day in school and celebrated Thanksgiving. And that was, but then, it's been a long time. And then England, obviously, so I'm technically my home. I'm British now, but obviously I'm not. So, but it's fun. You're not at home anywhere, but you're home everywhere.
That's that homelooseness, I guess.
Exactly.
And I guess I'm just curious how you would identify yourself Jewishly these days, or if there are pieces that feel meaningful to you.
I think I'm not particularly observant, but I love the ritual and cultural elements of Jewishness. And I think I would love to be integrated more into a Jewish community, but by the fact that where I live and it's just kind of the context you live in really makes a difference to how you experience Jewishness, I think. From what I said about living in LA and having this joyous experience of Jewishness and being integrated into my family's Jewish life there, from there to Hungary, where it was the opposite experience, now to kind of a more neutral ground where I kind of pick and choose the elements of Jewish life that I want to take part in.
Well, I thank you for writing this story. I think the Jewish elements are not central to appreciating or enjoying the novel at all, but I think they add a depth and a complexity to understanding a different Jewish experience as an American reader that I really appreciated. And the word that kept coming back to me is just sparkling. Like, there was just so much wit, there was just so much joy in the writing that I just loved reading it. So thank you for writing it.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so glad you liked it.
And thank you for joining us today. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us today for the 5 Books. Our guest today was Fran Fabriczki talking about her book, Porcupines. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love to hear all about it. Drop us a comment on our Instagram @5bookspod or to our email team@5bookspod.org. If you'd like an email reminder to keep you up to date with new episodes, plus links to all the books we discussed and even more book recommendations, you can sign up for our newsletter in the show notes or on our website, 5bookspod.org. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin. Editorial and website support from Amelia Merrill. Music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions. Art by Alad Lifshitz of the Dove Abramson Studio. Thank you especially to the Jewish Book Council, and thank you to Felicia Herman and David Ben-Or.